I'm Ali Swinsky, Vice President of Research at NBR. And it's a great pleasure to welcome everybody to this evening session, which is our final panel, as Audrey noted, of this year's Asia Edge Conference, Pathways to Energy Security in the Indo-Pacific. So over the past 2 days, we heard from Ambassador Virginia Palmer and a range of experts from across the Indo-Pacific about building sustainable energy transitions in the region. With a renewed emphasis on climate change in US foreign policy, panelists discussed the importance of engagement with partner countries in a region hungry for energy and economic growth, and stressed the risk of losing recent renewable gains as the pandemic continues into its second year. We heard from colleagues at the ADB about innovative financing tools to help retire coal plants without stranding those investments. We also heard from power sector experts on how to build a 21st century grid, not only through international power trade and energy storage, but also through improved human capacity and updated mindsets. So, to close out this week's events, we're very excited to have a discussion on critical minerals and supply chains and how the rise in demand for renewable energy will affect global trade. From wind turbines and solar panels to batteries for vehicles and electricity storage, critical minerals play a role at every stage of the energy transition. Where and how those minerals are mined and processed will be key to the energy security of the future. But before we begin, I just want to thank everybody on the MBR team for helping make this event possible. To our panelists, certainly, for their insights into these topics, and to you, our audience, for your active participation throughout the conference. So, without much further ado, I'd like to turn things over to our moderator, Jim SLUTZ. Jim is the Director of Study Operations for the National Petroleum Council and previously served as Acting Assistant Secretary of Fossil Energy at the United States Department of Energy. He serves as Chair of the Committee on Earth Resources and is a member of the Board of Earth Sciences and Resources of the National Academies of Sciences. He's also an advisor to NBR. So with that, Jim, the floor is yours.
Okay, now that I've unmuted, thank you so much, Ali, for that kind introduction. And it is again just a wonderful pleasure to be part of an NBR event, something I always look forward to during the year. So we have I think an interesting program this evening to hopefully end a very interesting conference. Let me start with just a couple comments, and then we'll get underway with a very knowledgeable panel on this topic of supply chains and critical minerals. And we might branch just a little bit within that space because it's such a new and evolving topic. But first, just to set a couple ground things on energy. A little bit of grounding is that that the world needs more energy, and that includes oil and natural gas and all primary energy sources. And that's based on the Energy Information Administration's International Energy Outlook from February of this year, that energy consumption grows by 50% to 2050. And that's primarily because of global population growth and GDP growth. And that's good because there's less energy poverty, and this growth is because there's the increase in energy is in developing countries. So reducing energy poverty is the right path, and reducing energy emissions is also the right path. So one of the just a couple thoughts before we jump into energy minerals, because whenever we talk about different energy sources, it's important to note that every technology and every energy source has different trade-offs. And it might be a good idea that we stop categorizing energy as good and bad. And even using the terms clean and dirty creates an adversarial environment that doesn't reflect the range of trade-offs between different energy sources. By using the term trade-offs to discuss pros and cons, we move away from adversarial positions. We move into a problem solving. We move to good options while we strive for the best solution. So it's a huge challenge. We'll require working together for every choice, because every choice has different trade-offs. And I think as we work through some of these supply chains and critical minerals issues, that will very much highlight the need to think in a real positive, forward-leaning, problem-solving way. Ambassador Palmer mentioned the EIA report that was just released yesterday on critical minerals. So I'll kick off just with a couple tiny, few points that I think frame this discussion. That until the 2010s, so less than like in the last 10 years, the energy sector represented a small part of the total demand for most minerals. The share of demand rises significantly over the next 2 decades, over 40% for copper and rare earth elements, 60 to 70% increase for nickel and cobalt, and almost 90% for lithium. Actually, that percentages of the production go to the energy system. Electric vehicles and battery storage have already displaced consumer electronics to become the largest consumer of lithium. Nickel use in EVs is set to overtake the use of stainless steel by 2040 in its use. And think how much stainless steel is made in the world. So these are huge shifts. So the system is not systems in the world are not typically set to change at scale. The most changes are incremental. The Paris Agreement, as projected in the International Energy Administration Sustainable Development Scenario, would mean quadrupling of mineral requirements for new energy technologies by 2040. Lithium sees the fastest growth, with demand rising by over 40 times in the SDS scenario, followed by graphite, cobalt, and nickel around 20 to 25 times. So we'll get to some of those challenges as we, in the past, strains on the supply-demand balance have prompted investment. Supply and demand imbalances create price volatility. That's how economics works, and higher prices prompt investment. But this will have an impact on the energy system and the energy transition. Higher prices could mitigate anticipated cost reductions in EV and renewable technology. For example, expected supply from existing mines and projects under construction is estimated to meet only half of projected lithium and cobalt requirements and 80% of copper by 2030. Also making investment decisions challenging is the uncertainty of demand. For example, cobalt demand could be anything between 6 to 30 times today's level, depending on assumptions about the evolution of battery technology and climate policies. So for comparison, a 30-year oil and natural gas demand outlooks vary between the reference case and high and low cases. They vary by about between 20 and 30%, not hundreds of percent. So there are other factors that also make investment decisions difficult and potentially slow development of new supply sources. And today's panel is going to look at some of these challenges, but in the spirit of the theme of trade-offs, identifying both opportunities as well as challenges. We will seek to identify opportunities to address these challenges. We will look at development lead times, touch on resource quality perhaps, recycling as a source of supply, growing scrutiny of environmental and social performance, climate risk exposures in minerals and supply chains, and energy and resource security of supply. And what does energy security mean in this new energy world? And that's really where I know the NBR team brings a lot of expertise in looking at these issues. So to kick us off this morning or this evening, and just to remind everybody, we're just for speakers, I'm sharing just a very brief introduction, and the full bios are in the conference materials. But to kick off our discussion today, Cameron Johnson, who's a partner with TidalWave Solutions, is going to share some thoughts on current considerations with existing supply chains, how the policy might be impacting them, and we'll ask Cameron to give us a sense of the market in the near term. So Cameron?
Thanks, Jim, for that introduction, and good morning or evening, everyone, wherever you are in the world. And thanks to NBR for giving me this opportunity. I'm really excited to learn from the panelists and also, get your questions, and hopefully we can resolve some issues today. Today, I thought I'd start with, there's three things to really review. One is what is happening in supply chains generally in the region. How are some government policies affecting trade and supply chains? And finally, what does the future hold? And first, what's going on in supply chains, still in full force in many parts of the world? Supply chains overall generally are not moving, except on the periphery, such as with textile, shoes, low-value goods. There was some movement due to the trade war between China and the U.S. It affected countries, particularly Vietnam, that grew substantially from the opportunities that came from that. But that growth has subsided, at least at this time. With the effects of the pandemic ongoing, particularly affecting regions such as Europe, South America, parts of Asia, that went to those areas are to China, to slack in many ways for that, because it's one of the few large still functioning and still way. What we do see, particularly on China, is a down effect, where
Cameron,
companies who are already here. Yeah.
Cameron, we're having a little bit of difficulty with your connection. If it continues, it may be helpful for you to go off video just for your opening remarks. That would be a shame, but go ahead and give it a go. But you've been kind of, I think, are other people having a bit of problem with Cameron? Okay, a little bit. So let's give it another go, but we might ask you to just do audio if necessary, okay?
Okay. Sorry, guys. This is unfortunately welcome to the wonderful world of China internet. So, all right. I'll just review. So supply chains generally aren't moving. Overall, what we do see is a doubling down in China, particularly for companies that are already here. For example, Procter & Gamble is investing $100 million in a new R&D facility in Guangzhou. Toyota is investing $400 million into Pony I, which is a major Chinese startup in the electrical vehicle space. And BMW is investing $620 million in Dongbei, which is northeastern China. Some of the trends that we're seeing, again, not much movement of supply chains yet. An American Chamber of Commerce survey in 2020 of U.S. businesses in China showed that less than 15% of respondents were moving or considering moving outside of China. And with that, only 4% were actually returning to the U.S. Secondly, what was originally a China plus one strategy, where companies would have a primary facility in China and then maybe a secondary one in one of the ASEAN countries, has now evolved into a hub and spoke concept, which is China will remain the primary facility, and then satellite facilities in other parts of the world, such as Eastern Europe, ASEAN, and the Americas will be opened up to support business. Third was FDI, investment explode China in 2020, up 6% to $163 billion. The ASEAN countries overall saw a drop of 31% in FDI in 2020. And finally, the focus of movement on supply chains critical to national security is one of the huge themes at the moment, particularly with semiconductors, pharmaceuticals, and PPE as just some examples. Next, on the policy impacts of what's going on with government policy, the first real impact in the last year has been RCEP, which is the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, a trade agreement that was signed. What it does is it essentially does four major things that did not exist previously in the region. The first, it creates a harmonized rule and playing field for everybody, instead of individualized rules and various bilateral agreements. Secondly, it brings together 30% of the world's population and 30% of the world's GDP under a single banner. Third is it has access to preferential duty rates. And fourth, there's a standardized documentation requirement now across the entire region. And again, this is minimizing disruption and growing efficiency, particularly now that documentation is standardized. Some current examples, and this was just signed and is in the last 6 months or so. It's removing tariffs on 86% of Japan's imports into China. Japan expects an increase to its GDP of 2.7%. Japan is eliminating 56% of tariffs on Chinese agricultural goods. Malaysia expects an increase of up to 1.7% on its GDP and for exports to continue to grow. And one of the effects, particularly in the US, they're seeing felt because of this new trade agreement is orders for US products such as cattle are on the downfall. They're not coming back. The next policy challenge is, again, this national security review that most countries are doing, particularly the US and Australia. And what we do see is that that is going to substantially change certain supply chains. And I'll leave it to the panelists after me to kind of go into those in greater detail. And finally, what does the future hold? In this decade, we're going to see continued integration on a regional level in manufacturing supply chains. The supply chains that are currently entrenched will be further entrenched, and those newer supply chains will actually span across other parts of the region where they didn't do so previously. This is going to spur incredible foreign direct investment into the region, especially anything related to technology, raw materials, green energy, and consumer products and services. Secondly, expect tension to increase in the region, particularly between the US, China, Europe, and Australia. The supply chain reviews that are ongoing that will be completed this year will see and dictate some of that, but it's going to be a huge challenge, particularly this decade. Third is decoupling is not happening in any meaningful way. Particularly in the West, the word decoupling has been used often. It's just simply not happening. If it did, or if it was, the FDI number for China would not be so high, and US pension funds would not be investing into China as they are. And finally, to conclude, in the next decade, not only is this integration going to drive economic efficiency, it's also going to lower the chance of any conflict in the region. So, and Jim, I'll leave it back to you, and thanks everybody for putting up with my strange connection.
Cameron, thanks so much. Now we'll move on to our next speaker, Mirza Sadaquat HUDA, who's a postdoctoral research fellow at the OSCE Academy in Bishke. So, Mirza, let me turn it over. Oh, well, Mirza is going to share with us a bit grounding it in his research area in how is resource nationalism and inclusion of local actors resource nationalism and inclusion of local actors under underappreciated aspects of energy cooperation, and how does this pertain specifically to critical minerals and materials? So, Mirza.
Thank you very much, Jim, and many thanks to NBR for hosting this really important and interesting event. So today I would speak very briefly about the political issues around rare earth elements. So I will divide my comments into two categories. First, I would speak about geopolitics, and secondly, I would speak about the political systems of the countries that have the largest deposits of rare earth elements and how this affects systems of governance and ultimately supply chains. So firstly, in terms of geopolitics, there is no doubt that rare earth elements have an impact on geopolitics. The most pertinent example of the geopolitical impact of rare earth elements was China's embargo on exporting rare earth elements to Japan in 2010, following a territorial dispute. And this also had an impact on the US because the United States imports a lot of the finished products that Japan's make from rare earth elements imported from China. And the very fact that we're having this conversation today and that rare earth elements are being raised by the most senior policymakers as a geopolitical and strategic issue, makes it very obvious that rare earth elements have a strategic impact. However, in recent years, energy scholars have argued that the geopolitical impact of rare earth elements may be somewhat exaggerated. And the importance of the perceptions of energy scholars comes from the fact that rare earth elements are perceived from a strategic lens, primarily because of their importance to energy transition, as Jim eloquently mentioned. Yet some scholars like Indra Overland, Anders Goldtau, based in the United States, based in Europe, have argued that such perceptions are somewhat overblown. And I would just like to touch upon three broad issues that highlight the fact that essentially rare earth elements are geopolitically important, but it is somewhat incorrect to put them in the same category as the energy geopolitics of oil and gas. So firstly, if we look at the issue of supermagnets, so supermagnets are an inherent component of wind turbines, and supermagnets are dependent on rare earth elements. However, only a few wind turbines around the world are dependent on supermagnets. So, for example, only 2% of the wind turbines in the United States actually use supermagnets. And there are other technologies such as software and cheaper electronics that can be used to turn these wind turbines. But this is not broadly discussed in policy and research arenas. There always seems to be this sort of consternation around how any sort of control over rare earth elements by China can impact upon the production of supermagnets and hence impact energy security of the United States. But this is not really backed up by data or evidence. And secondly, as Jim mentioned, the fluctuation in demand of rare earth elements is much greater over time than oil and gas. And Cameron mentioned that we are expecting huge amounts of investment into rare earth elements in the near future. And from these two perception brought forward by my fellow speakers, I would like to suggest that it doesn't make sense for us to attach permanent or even long-term geopolitical interests to rare earth elements, because in the near future, due to technological innovation, due to investment, one rare earth element can become obsolete and can easily be replaced in the production of electronics or towards the development of energy transition. And one example is the reduced intensity of rare earth elements in recent years. For example, germanium is reduced at a much lower intensity in energy transition now than it was a couple of years ago. So energy transition is essentially inherently dependent on innovation and technology. So it's a bit difficult to attach geopolitical imperatives on such a dynamic industry. And lastly, renewable energy is very different from the geopolitics of non-renewables. So now I'm just looking back at the broader issue of energy geopolitics around renewables, because ultimately that's what would determine the politics of supply chains of rare earth elements. So when it comes to non-renewables like oil and gas, the geopolitics are centered around the location of the resources and transportation choke points. So for example, the location of oil and gas in the Middle East and the maritime geopolitics of the Strait of Hormuz, for example. However, for renewable energy, the resources are much more diffuse, and the transportation is undertaken by undersea cables, overland cables, and this makes the geopolitics around energy transition and renewable energy marked by issues such as technology and innovation and intellectual property rights, competition around technology, rather than transportation choke points and the physical location of the resources. So in terms of the second issue that I'm going to speak about, I would just like to draw the attention of the participants to the global issue of democratic backsliding. So as we all know, in recent years, there has been a marked increase in autocratization and a decrease in democratic systems of governance. So ultimately, supply chains are a product of systems of governance, and governance is determined by political systems. Now, the countries that have the largest number of deposits of rare earth minerals don't really have substantiated democratic credentials. So if you look at the six largest deposits of rare earth elements, they are all located in countries that are classified by the Global Freedom House Index as not free or partly free. The only countries that have large rare earth elements deposits and are classified as free, in other words, they are free democratic systems of governance, are the United States, Australia, and Brazil. The rest of the countries have faced increasing levels of autocratization, and as a result, I guess it raises the question about how you can govern these global supply chains between political systems that have such broad differences between them. So essentially, these are the two broad issues that I want to speak about today in terms of geopolitics and politics of supply chains of rare earth elements. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mirza. What a great set of comments, and we're going to come back around to some of those in the discussion, I think. So next we have Kristin, and I'm VEKASI. Did I say that correctly? Associate professor with the University of Maine. And Kristin, I'm going to ask you to kick off this conversation that this group really cares deeply about, which I guess is more of a continuation, but the geopolitical and security implications of these supply chains, and how does the growing new energy systems growth and the inherent demand growth in critical minerals and materials impact these strategic considerations? So Kristin, look forward to your comments here.
Absolutely, thank you. And I've been enjoying this conversation so far, and thanks so much for inviting me to take part. And I absolutely agree with Mirza that we should all be calm, but I may be not quite as sanguine about the situation, but I think we'll have an interesting discussion here. So in my brief remarks here, I'm going to talk about two general things. And first, I'm going to talk about some of these challenges that the geopolitical situation and also the market in general brings to matching supply with the increasing demand that Jim really laid out really well at the beginning. And I'm going to walk through some examples of what Japan did when Japan did face the supply shock. supply shock after 2010, and then draw that forward into some of the policies that the United States and other countries are pursuing now, and how that might work in the future. So one of the things there's a few different ways that we could look forward into the future and think about how the increased demand for things like lithium, cobalt, nickel, neodymium are how supply can meet that demand. And often what we talk about is diversification, and there's different types of diversification. One of them is finding new mines and developing new mines and new production. But then there's also technological diversification with developing new recycling techniques, substitution techniques, which again, Mirza outlined some paths there as well. And both of those are important. I'm going to talk a little bit more on the mining side in my comments here, but we can talk about other things as well. And this is tricky. It's challenging to diversify. And one of the reasons it's challenging is because of some of these political risks in the high reserve countries that Mirza brings up. But another reason it's challenging is that a lot of these critical minerals are in places where we do see these choke points there, and they're typically choke points for a reason. It's because it's efficient. It's profitable. It's easy to do business that way. And that's why we see the supply chains the way they are. And that's why we also see choke points. So if we think about some of the critical minerals that are key in this discussion, like we can think about rare earths. Right? China has about 30% of the reserves, more of the production, less than they did in 2010 as a share of the globe, and followed by other countries, which Mirza brought up. We also see with cobalt, for example, where the Democratic Republic of the Congo, the DRC, has about 50% of reserves, followed by Australia. Lithium, Chile has is the world leader in reserves, not in production. That is also Australia. India also has a lot of rare earths. You might see some quad action, right, developing here. But these are very high percentages, right? These are places where it's difficult to build supply chain resilience if that looks like diversification and diversified supply. Now, Japan is a case where Japan really actively, after this 2010 supply shock, created both by Chinese export quotas, right, trade policy, and then also by this feared weaponization of China's rare earths during this territorial dispute, which Japanese firms claimed and the Chinese state denied, and whether or not whatever happened, right, Japanese companies and the state reacted as if there was this weaponization of the rare earth supply. And following that, the Japanese private sector, as well as the Japanese state, responded. They reacted, but then they continued to take fairly proactive steps. I'm going to walk through a few of these, and we'll look at my map here too. So the first thing, one of the things that the Japanese state did, the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry, provided support for the Japanese private sector. And they did this through competitive grants, through subsidies. And they did it in three realms. And one was new basic research to develop substitutes for rare earths. And a number of companies received grants for that. Another was developing new technologies for recycling. And there have been a lot of steps forward in Japan as well as other places in the world following this time. And then a third was through international diversification. So offering startup money for companies to try and seek non-Chinese sources for rare earth metals. But they also worked closely. That was not all that Japan did. They also worked closely with this group called JOGMEC, the Japan Oil, Gas, and Metals National Corporation. It's a state-owned enterprise. And JOGMEC, and if you look at the map right here, you can see the triangles that are in most continents around the world. Those represent JOGMEC projects that started around 2010 or later. Some of them did start before this, the geopolitical shock, and that attempted to open up get a more secure supply chain for Japan. Some of these projects, many of these projects failed. They were not all successful in building new supply. Some of them were successful, and some of them they also did in conjunction with private firms. So one successful example was with the Australian company Linus, and JOGMEC worked with SLUTZ, the Japanese company, to open up, to open up the mines, the existing mines, to ship those rare earths to Malaysia, and they opened up a processing plant in Malaysia. However, that processing plant in Malaysia is very contentious. It's very polluting. The people there are not happy about the presence, and so there's contractual issues, there's environmental issues. This very much comes to the issue that Jim brought up, that these are trade-offs. This is a nasty, dirty process, and although Toyota needs those metals to make the batteries for electric vehicles, there's still these deep challenges. Now, if you'll just look at the next slide very quickly, Japan's diversification was fairly successful. That they went from 90% from China to some 40% today. You'll note that the U.S. on the bottom there it's a kind of not as dependent on China in any time, but is running about steady. So, what are some takeaways here? Well, one is that private companies, you typically need some level of motivation in order to pursue these more diversified supply chains beyond just the economic fundamentals. It's typically difficult for it to be profitable, and there's high levels of political risk, of environmental risk to starting these new projects. Lots of the projects, again, fail. And new mines around the world see a lot of difficulty, a very long time horizon in starting up, and some of them will not come to fruition. And so one of the things that Japan did is they provided state support at these critical junctures to get over that initial risk. So what lessons could the United States maybe take from this? Well, one is that, if the state, the government is going to be involved, if diversification is part of a resilient supply chain, then it's really important to get the policies right and get the incentives right. So Japan did subsidies. That's maybe one way that could do that. Japan has a lot of experience with industrial policy, right? But there's other policy tools, including guaranteed purchase from new mines, which often don't succeed because of price volatility. Another is to partner with the private sector and public-private partnerships, restoring research private sector pipelines for new technologies, for substitution, for recycling, for cleaner mining methods. This is something the U.S. used to do really well with critical minerals, and we're starting to do better again with Department of Energy policies and some other things that are starting up, but we could do more of that. But then there's also multilateral approaches. For example, with Japan, we just signed this U.S.-Japan Competitiveness and Resilience Partnership in April. And we can work with our allies, follow their lead, and tie into some of those supply chains and partnerships. And I'll wrap up there. Thank you.
Thank you, Kristin. Thanks for all of these opening presentations. I think it gives a lot of food for thought, and we have a lot of different areas. We have one, and I have some different ones, but one of the ones I had is aligned with one of the questions / comments that came in from Bill Eichord. Hello, Bill. Good evening. And it is when looking at political and social aspects of rare earth minerals, one should also consider how the local regulatory environment affects their availability. For example, the largest U.S. mine is located in a sensitive area of the California desert, and the proper processing these minerals is energy intensive, expensive, and requires appropriate environmental control technologies. And how are these factors being incorporated? And that gets into this whole issue, which was one of the key kind of both challenges and opportunities presented in the IEA report was social and environmental and social performance. And it goes exactly, Kristin pointed, it was some of these issues of trade-offs, because one of the criticisms of that we're developing these minerals in areas of the country that or areas of the world that may not have some of the same environmental controls of developed countries. And how do we there's obviously there's World Bank frameworks, there's different things, but how do we build some of those systems into place so we're not just you know, trading off lower carbon emissions for higher other environmental impacts, because I don't think that is the kind of win-win that we're looking for. So appreciate thoughts on that from, and I think that goes to all three of our panelists, because I think there's I mean, China has been criticized on a whole variety of social and justice issues as well as environmental issues, and you mentioned Malaysia, Kristin, in your comments. So a combination of is that the way it has to be to produce these, I think, is one question, and the other question is what are the frameworks that these multilateral organizations can work on to improve this? So I'll let you guys, Kristin, you look like you're ready to jump in, and then we'll go to Cameron and Mirza when they're ready as well, if they have some comments.
No, I suspect that Mirza has thought about this maybe a little bit more than me. So, but you can see me nodding my head enthusiastically because I absolutely agree, and that I think that comment is just right on point. And one of the concerns I have when I look at other potential, for example, rare earth mines around the world, that this is say, oh well, diversification will be an export of pollution, right? And that's not the green energy future that I think we should be pursuing, and that the costs of I think there is an opportunity here for sort of win-win technology transfer, that the costs of developing better mining technology should be borne by the end use country, and that's one sort of way to maybe balance trade-offs. But I'd like to hear what Mirza has to say.
Okay, Mirza, we'll put you on the spot then.
Thanks very much, Jim and Kristin. In regard to the environmental impacts of rare earth minerals, I guess one of the issues that can impact how we deal with these problems is the strength of the civil society. So, as Jim mentioned, many of these countries don't necessarily have open political systems, which on one hand, they don't support civil society networks that can, that can force governments to address environmental concerns, that can put corporations in the spotlight for environmental harm or human rights violations. And on the other hand, they don't necessarily welcome INGOs that work on the environmental impact of mineral extraction. For example, we have the Natural Resources Governance Institute, which has done, some significant work in difficult countries like Myanmar, some work in Vietnam as well. So I guess it just boils down to whether the system of governance in the particular country actually supports, higher standards, higher social and environmental standards, or does it actually support the interests of the powers that be? I guess in the case of Malaysia, for example, as Kristin mentioned, there was a lot of vociferous sort of there was a lot of consternation regarding the development of the mineral processing, and the media and NGOs all picked up on it and reported about it. But I don't really necessarily see that this will be the case in some of the countries that have large deposits. So I guess one of the ways we can get around it is some form of international standard. We have the IFC standard. We also have things like the Energy Charter for energy trade. We have the EITI standards for extractive industries. So we just have to kind of look at these standards and try and get all the parties on board. And this would require cooperation and leadership from the United States, and of course from China as well. From my humble knowledge, I suppose the only way we can get around the environmental and social impacts of rare earth mineral extraction is to build capacities at the grassroots and also have some form of engagement at the international level.
Okay, thanks, Mirza. Cameron, let me ask you to address that, but particularly since you do a lot of, since you're working in China, and the sense of, China is becoming a more advanced society. They have advanced technology, but historically, there was a sense that they weren't as focused on the environmental, and clearly there are different social issues in some regions that folks have raised concerns. But what do you think the opportunity is there for addressing some of these environmental and social performance issues in China?
Yeah, I think it's a complicated question. But one of the things we do see in the trends is an absolute focus on green and clean energy. To your point, I think most here realize that there has been a challenge, particularly with the environment. So you're seeing not only investment in a large scale, infrastructure, but you're also seeing huge investments in new technologies. For example, China has 90% of the world, 90% of Asia's wind blade capacity. They added more wind blades last year alone than the US did until 2019. So the explosion of green energies and technologies is unprecedented. Secondly, with that, you are seeing, and this happens with countries as they go up the value chain, you are seeing continued focus on we have to clean things up. I can tell you, just living in Shanghai, the days where you would have heavy pollution are much less than they were, not that they're non-existent, but I think you're see this more and more regional level. I was in Singapore one year for a meeting, and they were complaining about the smoke of the forest fires. I think it was from Indonesia. So I think what we're seeing really is a region-wide focus on where different people are doing things, and that's wonderful, but now we need to start collaborating more together on a regional level, whether, kind of to Mirza and Kristin's points, sharing best practices, sharing technologies. I think we're really going to see that accelerate this decade.
Great.
Could I jump in just a little?
Yeah, sure.
Very briefly. So when we think about regional and international cooperation on trying to spread best practices, reduce social and environmental harm, one of the best ways that this has worked in other issue areas is when companies are liable in home courts. And that needs to be something that's very much multilateral, because it does put companies at a disadvantage if they have to be behaving at US standards in other countries, or behaving at German standards in other countries. But if there is home liability, then that's a strong mechanism. And that's something that there's been some limited success with that. It's sort of off and on. It does take strong leadership, and the United States would have to take a leadership role in doing that. But if we are serious about having strong standards abroad, there's strong support for that mechanism.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting because if you look, and I just happened to be seeing Bill Eichhorn's picture, and he spent a long career in the oil and gas industry, and he and I had occasion to travel to China for some different events years ago, and it was quite fascinating that was one of the challenge when the U.S. companies were invited to come into China, is their company standards were much higher than the state Chinese company standards for a very long time, and in fact, and sometimes they were given more difficult places to operate that had challenging situations because of that. So I hear Bill shaking his head. So I think there's some, again, this idea of not just trade-offs, but looking for solutions along the whole value chain and the whole energy system. And I'm a big advocate that these big energy companies are probably likely to be part of the big solution. And some of that is what learnings we've learned from other sectors. And so I think this might be one that is worth pursuing. Let me kind of switch a little bit, because we talked about, I'm gonna throw a slight curveball, but the IEA came out with that report. One of the challenges, I think, when you look at critical minerals, I've seen reports that there's like, the challenge is it's, what's a critical mineral and what's just a mineral kind of depends on your point of view. If you don't need it, it's not so critical. And but I think there's like 57, on some people's lists of critical minerals. The interesting is they've grown over time, because as technologies become more sophisticated, there's more variety of minerals and alloys and things like that. And there are all sorts of complexities with the thing I'm going to ask you guys, but is there sufficient tracking and pricing data for this? And does the market need some kind of entity like the IEA for critical minerals, like we do oil prices and natural gas prices and the Energy Information Administration, and is there a way for this to become more of a commodity business? And I know that's bridging out of the energy security, but it's kind of somewhat related, because if we don't know, if we're struggling with what the supply, and if we don't know whether the supply and demand is going to be between 6 or 30 times today, it's really tough to plan, and it's tough to encourage investment. Thoughts? We'll reverse it. Cameron, any thoughts? Because you work in that commercial. What's that, Kristin?
They are terrible. We definitely need better data. And so many of these really wonderful, detailed studies out there say, we've traced this process and we do this, and here's our resilience framework, but we can't really test it because we have terrible data. So yeah, I think there's a really strong need for a trustable, sort of centralized way for us to be able to track these and to think about them as commodities with prices that everybody would know, and that you can have a real market. That would also, I think, help with price volatility. And it would help scholars everywhere.
Yeah, scholars always want data. That's from I've appreciated that from my work with the national academies. Mirza or Cameron, any thoughts on that?
I think Kristin summarized brilliantly. The fact is really just is not enough information for us to be able to make decisions like that, or even know which direction to go. That's part of the problem, particularly when you talk about diversification. There's just not enough information out there to make really good decisions. So people are going on assumptions and hopes. So.
Okay.
I actually have a question. Is there any international agreement on the extraction of rare earth elements that can perhaps lead the way for this IEA-like organization that you envision, Jim? Is there any kind of international agreement on the extraction of rare earth elements?
I don't really know the answer to that, Mirza, but I do know that like for instance, the United States Geological Survey has a pretty comprehensive system of tracking, and that's more global. But it's more as a scientific geologic agency. It tends to be what's out there and what's the resource capability, not it's not an economic agency that tries to, like an an Energy Information Administration, that tries to project demand into the future. And I think, I do know, I just know enough to know that it's incredibly complicated, because each of these every source is a little bit different ore, and every source has to be qualified for its use. And so it gets very complicated. So for instance, a new lithium mine could take 2 years to qualify its ore for a specific source and use. So that adds to the challenge of the long-term nature of it. So we have a couple minutes, and with this crowd, I want to, we talked a little bit about energy security. And Mirza, you had some really great points on how this may be a little different, but one of the things we've talked about is this potential situation where demand potentially exceeds supply. Again, it's for some of these minerals, and in that, and partly just because it takes there's one thing with the regulatory systems and other things that could potentially, again, we don't want to compromise the environment, but you could potentially figure out administratively how to move things faster. But some of the technical issues, such as building a processing plant, if it's going to take 2 years to build a processing plant, it takes 2 years. And if it takes multiple analysis that take many months, it's going to take time to qualify a resource. So, but in a world of tight supplies, and of course, there's things like the Japanese, which was a great example of looking for substitutes, because that is something that happens in this. But in a world of tight supplies, do critical minerals and materials, are they more likely, like in the case of the China-Japan issue, to become a trade tension issue where they're used to force? Maybe it's not a trade war, but it's a lot of trade leverage. And thoughts on how that might, and let's see, a related issue: do we need to be talking about should companies and countries be thinking about strategic stocks? Cameron?
Strategic stocks, no, just because it's too volatile, and I think Mirza made an excellent point, which is, in a couple of years, that same material could no longer be, valid in terms of the scale. So I think in terms of government, the best way to do that is really to support industry, support private enterprises as they continue to evolve. I think the technology issue is one that's really critical, because we all know that the lithium is going to basically outstrip supply probably in the next year or so. So to your point, Jim, it's absolutely critical to find an alternative or a substitute. So I think investment technology is going to play a key role in that everywhere, not just in China, but really, on a global level. And I think Kristin was jumping up and down, so she probably has a better point on that.
A point, Tad?
Sure. I'm just an enthusiastic nodder. I agree with you. Yeah, no, but
well, we want to have an enthusiastic panel, so that's perfect.
Yeah. So this question, basically agree about the question of stockpiling. With Cameron's comments on this question of whether or not they're likely to be an element in trade leverage. I also think this is a point where we should all remain fairly calm, that the benefits to the choke point countries of trading the elements, trading the critical minerals, I think outstrips their benefit as in any sort of trade dispute. And that's in terms of attracting downstream investment into being a part of these vibrant next generation technology supply chains. Right? All of those things come from the critical minerals being traded and for example, China being an integral part of and an endpoint part of the rare earth supply chain, for example, and that those benefits I think are seen very clearly, and that they outstrip narrow leverage that might be gained in a trade dispute. And we see what happens when choke points are used. Choke points are lost. That's the result. It might not have even been used with Japan, and it was still lost. Japan uses a choke point against South Korea, and then they're losing that semiconductor choke point. Right? There's high risks to using them, and I think it's important to have a resilient supply chain for lots of reasons, but fear of weaponization I think should be lower down on the list.
Okay, thank you. I think that's a really excellent point, and it leads us into some broader, maybe wrapping up with a couple broader trade questions. And Cameron, this may go back a little bit to you and a little bit to Mirza. You've been looking at this, but you mentioned this the regional comprehensive economic partnership and many of these minerals, or at least some of the processing, even the finished goods, like a lot of solar panels made in Asia are then shipped around the world. But so I appreciate that. But one of the things that I guess, Cameron, if you may have a few more comments on that, and I think in particular, one of the things that you and I touched offline is the fact that India chose not to be part of that, and maybe a little bit of thoughts on that, since they're such a huge and growing component in Asia.
Yeah, just with the RCEP, I mean, alone, it's going to add $500 billion to world trade by the end of this decade. So it's a game changer. And I think to your point, Jim, what we're really going to start to see is further integration. And I think Mirza had a good point overall about governance. It's not a bad thing that you have the region's, largest, second largest, and fourth largest economies all on a single platform, all further integrating. All learning from each other. So I think really what we're going to start to see in supply chains with that, where it is with rare earths, or it is with electronics or other products as technologies continue to advance, is that further integration is actually going to benefit and continue to lower tension. So to Kristin's point, there may be choke points, but they're never really going to be used because there's just such an integration. Why would you cut your nose off to spite your face? So I think really this decade is going to turn out to be that.
Mirza, we've kind of, did you have anything you wanted to add on the regional trade?
Yes, very quickly, Jim, I just want to mention that there is much reason to be optimistic about the potential of cooperation when it comes to energy transition and renewable energy, particularly because of initiatives like the Belt and Road Initiative. And I know there's a lot of strong opinions in the United States regarding the BRI, but the fact is, even competitive integration agendas like the free and open Indo-Pacific by the US, the One World, One Grid initiative by India about integrating, renewable energy grids around Asia. All of these issues, even if they are in competition with each other, they are ultimately pushing towards integration of some sort. So overall, I think there is much reason to be optimistic about maybe even peace building and some form of conflict resolution through renewable energy trade. So I think we're going to see an era of geopolitics that's marked by both by competition and cooperation when it comes to renewables and rare earth elements.
Okay, let me just, we have a couple quick questions, but what I'd like to do is just pose these questions that have come in kind of and because we're getting close to our time. So I'm going to pose those with the option to, let you kind of, if you wish, maybe give some comments on those, as well as your maybe a quick 30-second wrap up for the panel, and give you guys each a last word. So the questions, and I don't know if you guys can see those. One, if you can see them, is one is will there, in the time scale, will there be the ability to open the mining, or should we rely on replacement technologies, or maybe some of both? And then the other question noted that when we think about minus incentives to reduce CO2 emissions, some people propose border carbon adjustments. How about for critical rare minerals? The cost of processing should be addressed in that way. So anyway, those are two questions and thoughts, and then also we'll kind of go around and if you have, like, what's your key thought takeaway that you'd like to leave us with? And I know we're gonna go just a minute or two over, but I think that'll be okay. So anybody want to volunteer to go first? I'll let you. You can jump up, raise your hand, or I can call on you. Mirza, are you? I'll call on you first, because I've been picking on Cameron and Kristin a bit.
No worries, Jim. In regard to border carbon adjust mechanisms and rare earth minerals, I think Europe is about to implement border carbon adjustment mechanisms, which has raised a lot of political issues, particularly within developing countries. So the basic group of countries under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which includes Brazil, South Africa, India, and China, have objected to the implementation of border carbon adjustment mechanisms. And so I think if you were to implement this sort of mechanism to rare earth elements, it would definitely complicate the cooperative potential of these sort of important elements of energy transition. I mean, on one hand, you have to address the free rider problem in climate change mitigation, but on the other hand, you have to implement policies that do not encourage retaliation from important countries like India, South Africa, China. So it's really is about doing what is politically astute, because at the end of the day, addressing climate change, dealing our problems with the supply chains of rare earth elements are all political problems. So it's a little bit difficult to only address the environmental issues. I mean, I'm very much a tree hugger, by the way. I would only love to address the environmental issues and the social issues, but I mean, you can't deny the geopolitical, the realist elements. So I think you need to address carbon border mechanisms with a little bit of caution, especially when it comes to the conflict between developing countries and developed nations.
Thanks, Mirza. Cameron?
Yeah, just about the technologies and mining and so on. I think what we're going to really see is a hybrid. I think first we're going to see mining. We're going to see massive investment in new technologies. We're going to see replacement technologies as well. And I think really the third pillar of that is recycling. There really is no, at least as far as we can see, structural recycling mechanism. So I think this decade, you'll really start to see that included as well. So it won't just be replacement technologies and mining. You'll also have a recycling component that will continue to, as we produce more electrical cars, for example, continue to pick up speed as more and more material comes onto the market.
Kristin?
Yeah, I absolutely agree that that three-pronged approach, substitution, recycling, resilient, diversified supply chains, we'll see more mining. We're seeing more mining. There's a very controversial lithium mine that's trying to be opened in the US West right now. That we're going to see more of that. And I do think it's important for us to have, and by us, I mean the world, it's important for the world to have diversified, resilient supply chains and these critical minerals that will make, it will eventually help prices be more stable. It will make them more predictable, more easy to invest in these climate change mitigating new clean energy technologies that will make them more accessible for buyers around the world. But at the same time, as the United States, particularly as we do this, we really need to keep in mind that resilience and supply chain resilience, reducing vulnerability, it does not mean the same thing as protectionist self-reliance. And it should be done in a more open and multilateral and cooperative fashion.
Thank you. Let me just echo a couple comments, because I had the occasion a day ago to speak with a mining executive and pointed out that they're the last people that actually want substitution. They don't want prices so high that it drives people to substitution. They have a real vested interest of supplying the market. And I think part of that is making sure that whatever country you have the policies that allow that technology and innovation investment to happen. So you can find those solutions to those problems. And so let me just, I really appreciate our panelists today. I think we've had some great input. And so thank you so much for everybody's, for all of your preparation and for your input today. And thank you to NBR. We're always a pleasure to be part of a program here. And let me turn this back over to Tom, who's going to do the wrap-up comments for us.
Thank you so much, Jim. Thank you, Jim, and also Kristin, Mirza, and Cameron for an excellent panel. I learned a lot, and I helped you guys prepare for it. So it just shows the depth of your expertise. I know we could have spent a whole lot longer hearing from our experts on this subject, but I was really glad with the great conversation that we had, and NBR is very happy with the outcome. Thank you all for attending today's session. If we were giving out awards for perfect attendance, I would owe at least several of you one of those. So thank you for sticking with us through all of this week's conference panels. Tonight marks the end of this year's conference, but not the end of the Asia Edge program, and nor the end of the partnership between NBR and the Bureau of Energy Resources. We had the pleasure of hearing from all 5 of our first class of Asia Edge Fellows, including Mirza HUDA this evening. And we are also very excited to announce that the next class of Asia Edge Fellows has been selected over the past couple of days, and we'll be coming out with that announcement of the new fellows in a couple of weeks. So thank you to all of our colleagues at the State Department. Thank you to everyone at NBR, and once again to all of our speakers this evening. And thank all of you, our participants. We had a really great conversation going, and it was a pleasure to be a part of it. So I hope you all have a lovely evening, day, time, and we'll see you at future NBR events.